We've learned a tremendous amount about reality based upon what we've received in correspondence from people who are living on other realities. People who have gone on to what we call the afterlife. It isn't really an afterlife, it's all one life. We're on a spiritual plane right now. And the life that people are living on the next spiritual plane is exactly like this, except it doesn't have the drawbacks. But we're learning about our reality based upon what they're saying to us from their side about their reality. And as a result of that, we can say some things that we couldn't say before. In order to understand the nature of reality, we have to understand what these people in the other realms are saying to us. One of the things that we're learning is the relationship between the mind and the brain. We have to talk about consciousness or the mind in order to understand the nature of reality. And we have to answer some unanswered questions that people are asking, like how do we create our own reality? How do all of us together create this reality that we live in? How can people have near-death experiences and have sensory experiences, but they are not using their brain? How can people living in the next plane of life live in a world that's just like this world and very much the same way? They do things that we do. They experience things that we experience. They have buildings, they have streams, they have mountains. And how is all that possible on another realm of life that isn't on the earth plane? And how can an immaterial mind that is outside of the brain affect the brain and the body and life in general? So all of these questions need to be answered. And the nature of reality must explain these in order to be a complete explanation. So what I'm going to be talking about is the relationship first of the brain to the mind, because that's central to it. Now there are three explanations of the brain's relationship to the mind. One is that the brain creates the mind. Materialists believe that the brain creates the mind, secretes the mind, like the adrenal glands secrete adrenaline. There's no self in their conception, and the mind dies when the brain dies. The second conception is that the brain receives mind signals like a TV. The mind is outside of the brain, but the brain receives signals. The brain then uses those to make decisions, to navigate in the physical realm, to make the body do things. They believe that the mind is separate from the brain, but that these signals are coming to a physical body and a physical brain, and the physical body and brain then act. And the third conception is that the brain receives the mind from a field. Some believe that the mind is in a pervasive field that creates the physical world and merges with the brain that is in the physical world. So I'll take those one at a time. First, the idea that the brain creates the mind. And we know that that's not true. That'll be the easiest one to take care of. First, no neuroscientists will say that they understand how the mind could be created by the brain or where in the brain the mind is housed. There is nobody who has the answers to that question. Here's a list of scientists who are neuroscientists and surgeons. They are people who specialize in consciousness studies, and every one of them will agree, as all of the other scientists must, that they have no idea how the brain could create a mind. It's called the hard problem. They cannot find the mind in the brain. They don't know where it is. One of these neuroscientists was Wilder Penfield. He was a groundbreaking neuroscientist and physician. He said that if there were a mechanism in the brain that could do what the mind does, one might expect that the mechanism would betray itself in a convincing manner by some better evidence of epileptic or electrode activation. He spent his whole life looking for the mind in the brain. He was probing the brain when he was doing brain surgery, and he could never find a mind in the brain. He ended up at the end of his life saying the mind makes its impact on the brain, but is not in the brain. Another reason we know that the mind couldn't be in the brain is that the brain doesn't have the capacity to hold more than a few memories. Independent calculations by two scientists showed that the brain could not hold a life's memories. American computer science expert Simon Berkovich and Dutch brain researcher Herms Roman, working independently of one another, concluded that it's impossible for the brain to store everything you think and experience in your life. Another reason that we know that the mind is not in the brain is that people like remote viewers are able to experience seeing things without the eyes or the brain involved. I'll give you an example. Joe McMoneagle, who was remote viewer number 1 in Operation Stargate. It was a CIA operation to spy on the Soviet Union from 1978 to 1995. And Joe would sit in an office, and he had a recorder, someone who was sitting with him to take notes. And he would warm himself down for as long as 45 minutes. And after he had warmed down to the point where he was relaxed and he was able to get impressions, he would focus on whatever the target was. And all he had to do was know coordinates for the target or an idea of where the target was. He didn't need to know anything about it. So Joe would sit there with his eyes closed, and impressions would come into his mind. And then the person who was with him would sketch them as he described them, or Joe would sketch them himself. This is an example. Joe sat with his eyes closed. He focused on the target, and he knew that there was a target there. He didn't know what it was. And this is the sketch of what he was getting. It looked like there were hills. There were towers. He had the impression there was electricity, that the electricity was running through it, like in a grid. At the tops of the towers, there were halos, as he described them, but the halos were invisible. Then they showed him the picture, and this is the picture of what it was that he was remote viewing. These are, of course, the electrical grid of windmills that were making electrical power. And he was seeing the hills, and he was seeing the towers. He was seeing the halo at the top where they were spinning. And he was seeing all of that sitting in one location. This was a picture that was quite a distance away. It was outside of the building in another location. And he was able to see it. Now, that couldn't have happened if his mind had been confined to his brain. If it's inside that skull, encased in that skull, he wouldn't have been able to see that picture of those windmills and have the impression that there was electricity involved. Something was happening there that was making him see that without having to use the brain. I'm going to give you an example of my own because I do remote viewing. Many people can. It's a very, very common ability that people have. I did sessions with a man in New Jersey who was named Bill Walker. He just sent me an email and said he would like to see what it was like to do remote viewing. He was going to set up an object in his office, and he wanted me to remote view it from my office in Illinois. And so what happened is I sat in my office in Illinois, and I focused on his office in New Jersey. And after a while, I was warmed down, my eyes were closed, I started getting impressions. And so I sketched the impressions that I got. This is one of them that I got. It's rather like a cupola. And what I wrote was what you see on the picture, silver ribbed, amber, or gold between the ribs. A thick dimple-like thing. I actually meant a button-like thing, where the ribs come together. They're curved like a cupola with arms. I felt like it had a gold or a brassy color. It was round like a sugar bowl with a smooth lid. But it wasn't a jar, it felt like it was metal. So then Bill Walker sent back to me a picture of what it was that he had on one of the tables in his home. This was the object on Bill Walker's table. This is the two of them together. Now, it would have been impossible if my mind had been confined to my brain inside of my skull for me to have been able to get the impressions of that object in New Jersey when I was sitting in my office in Illinois. And also the feel of it, that it was metal, that it was gold, that it was brassy, and so forth. All of those things came to me just by relaxing my mind and allowing them to come into my mind. This is another example. This was an object, again, on Bill Walker's table in New Jersey. He put another object on a table, and I was going to view it. I got the impression that came into my mind, the vision of something that looked like it had petals on it. It was light peach. It looked like there were two leaves that were coming up, and I wrote down that it was green vegetation. At the bottom of it was a boxy-like thing. This is what it was. This is the comparison of the two. Now, it would have been impossible for me to have gotten that impression of that thing that was in New Jersey from my office in Illinois if my mind had been in my brain. So my mind had to have been separate. This is the kind of thing that we do all the time. We're able to see things that are thousands of miles away just by closing our eyes and focusing on what they are. Now the question is this something that's really valid, or is this just good guessing at what it might be? Well, I think it's pretty apparent from the look of it that it's not guessing, that these are very accurate. But studies were done based upon the government's work. They wanted to make sure that this was valid because they were putting money into it. And so the Stanford Research Institute did studies for the government. Edwin May, Ph.D., who was a researcher in low-energy experimental nuclear physics, did 154 experiments with 26,000 trials over 16 years. The finding was that the remote viewers could see without using their eyes no matter how many miles away the target was. The odds against its being by chance were 1 billion to 1. Other studies were done, studies by the Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC. After extensive studies, the final report by Jessica Utz, who was a professor of statistics at the University of California, Davis, concluded it is clear to this author that remote viewing is possible and has been demonstrated. Still other studies were done by the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, the PAIR Laboratory. They conducted 334 trials of remote viewing, and the remote viewers were successful with odds against chance of 100 billion to 1. So we know that remote viewers are successful in being able to sit, quiet their mind, and get impressions about things that are thousands of miles away. That can't happen if the mind is inside the brain. There are other reasons that we know that the mind is not confined to the brain. Blind people are able to see when the brain is shut down. In a near-death experience, the brain is not working. The brain is shut down. And in a near-death experience, the people are able to still see things. They're able to get impressions about things. Things come to them when their brain is not operating. Larry Dossey, who's former chief of staff of the Medical City Dallas Hospital, tells the story of Sarah. Sarah was having surgery when her heart stopped. When she awoke, Sarah described in detail what happened while her brain was not functioning. The frantic talk of the surgeons and nurses, the operating room layout, scribbles on the surgery schedule board outside, the color of the operating table sheets, the hairstyle of the head scrub nurse, the names of the surgeons in the doctor's lounge waiting for the operating room, and even the fact that her anesthesiologist was wearing unmatched socks that day. But the most remarkable thing about Sarah's experience was that Sarah had been blind since birth. Now, seeing is not something which a person automatically is able to do. Infants need to learn how to see. It takes months for them to learn how to see. Sarah had been blind since birth and had never experienced sight, and yet she was able to see acutely. She was able to remember what she saw. Other researchers have also found that near-death experiencers see without the eyes or the brain being involved. Kenneth Ring and Sharon Cooper wrote the book Mind Sight. They interviewed 31 blind and sight-impaired persons who had near-death experiences. 80% of them reported correctly visual experiences with actual colors and their surroundings. One patient who had become totally blind after being sighted for at least 40 years saw the patterns and the colors on the physician's new tie. That couldn't happen if the mind was reliant upon the brain for functioning. So we know that the brain does not create the mind. Neuroscientists who have studied the brain have not been able to discover how a brain could create a mind. Neuroscientists have not been able to find a mind in the brain. The brain does not have the capacity to hold memories. Remote viewers see without using the eyes or the brain. And blind people are able to see in near-death experiences when the brain is not functioning. So we know that the brain does not create the mind. I want to suggest a couple of books to you that you should look at if you want to know more about the mind and the brain. The first of these is by Larry Dossey, MD. It's called One Mind: How Our Individual Mind is Part of a Greater Consciousness and Why It Matters. The other book that I recommend is Your Eternal Self. It's my book. The book is published, but you can also look at it online. I've wanted to make it available to as many people as possible, so I put it online. It's at youreternalself.com. So that is the first explanation, that the brain creates the mind. That's simply not possible. The brain does not create the mind. The mind works very well outside of the brain. The second explanation is that the brain receives mind signals like a TV. Some believe that the mind is separate from the brain and it sends signals to the brain like the signals to a TV. so the brain can act in the physical realm. This is not a tenable explanation either, and I'll explain why. The skull has no orifice for a signal to come through. The skull is a hard, bony structure that encases the brain. The brain never sees the light of day, and yet these signals are supposed to come through to the brain somehow from outside, and there is no orifice through which that could happen. There's no entry point, for instance, for vision. I'll use vision as an example because it's so complex. As you know, billions of photons enter the pupil of the eye. They strike the retina at the back of the eye. The retina contains two types of photoreceptors, rods and cones. There are approximately 120 million rod cells and 6 million cone cells. The rods are for low light vision, the cones for daylight, bright colored vision. There are red sensitive, green sensitive, and blue sensitive cones. The photoreceptors lie in a layer against the back of the eyeball. In the second of the three cell layers, called the inner nuclear layer, are 4 types of horizontal cells, 11 types of bipolar cells, and 22 to 30 types of amacrine cells. In addition, the surface layer of the retina contains about 20 types of ganglion cells. There are electrical junctions between the cells and neurotransmitter receptors and transporters. When the photons strike the retina, the neurotransmitter chemical glutamate passes a signal from the photoreceptors to the bipolar cells to the ganglion cells. The horizontal and amacrine cells send signals using various excitatory and inhibitory amino acids, catecholamines, peptides, and nitric acid. When exposed to light, ion channels in the retina cell membranes close. Now, if your eyes are starting to glaze over because of the complexity of what this is describing, this is what it requires to have sight. For a signal to come through to the brain with remote viewing, so that you get sights from some distance, 1,000 miles, 2,000 miles away, for that to come into the brain, that signal is going to have to duplicate all those things that are going on with the retina, with the ganglion cells, with the optical cortex. Everything is going to have to be duplicated in the same way in order for the brain or the mind to have a visual experience. It's impossible for that signal to come through and do all of that to create that kind of vision in the mind. The same thing happens in a memory. When you bring up a memory, in order to have that vision in your mind, there must be neurons, billions of neurons, that are dedicated to making that vision happen. In the same way that you have billions of photons coming in to make a vision that you get in the retina. It would be impossible for a signal to come through and contain all of that information that would make all of that happen. A signal from outside of the brain could not result in remote viewing. A signal with billions of bits of information in perfectly coded order so that they recreated a vision could not exist. Lead-lined Faraday cages don't interfere with remote viewing or psychic activity. In other words, electromagnetism is not causing a signal to come into the brain. Thousands of feet of ocean water don't interfere with remote viewing when remote viewers have been in submarines. The curvature of the Earth doesn't interfere with it. There's no signal coming over the curvature of the Earth. The distance doesn't weaken the signal. A distance should weaken a signal, as in electromagnetism's weakening over a distance. And the experience happens instantaneously. So the person who's doing the remote viewing gets the vision immediately. There is no delay in the signal getting there. So we know that a signal couldn't be coming through with that complex amount of information that would somehow do something to the brain and then make the brain have the vision. But there are other reasons we know that that's not possible. The immaterial, meaning the mind, it's outside of the brain, can influence the material, meaning the physical realm. How can the immaterial mind have an influence upon the physical brain to bring electricity to it, to make it do those functions that it would have done if it had been using the sensory apparatus? For instance, the electromagnetism that comes through the eye. That signal coming from outside would have to duplicate that. There would have to be electricity that was coming in to influence the material realm. The real difficulty with that is pointed out by Swami in the Conscious Universe. If there is a loss or gain of energy, it violates the law of the conservation of matter and energy. If a non-material mind interacts with a material body, there must be an exchange of energy between the two domains. However, the energy of the material universe remains constant. That's the law of conservation of energy. There has been no evidence to show that energy is given to or gained from the mental domain. So we know that the brain is not receiving mind signals coming from outside of it. There is no way for the mind to interact with the brain. Signals to the brain would decrease in strength over distance and could not travel over the curvature of the earth. People in near-death experiences can see and hear normally, but the brain is not functioning. The mind, which is immaterial, could not affect the brain, which is material. And the minds influencing the brain would require the creation of energy from the immaterial mind to transfer into the physical realm to make the brain work. That would violate the conservation of matter and energy. So we know that this is not an explanation for the relationship of the mind to the brain. The last explanation is that the brain receives the mind from a field. Some believe that the mind is in a pervasive field that creates the physical world and merges with the brain that is in the physical world. In this explanation, the brain merges with the mind in a field, and the field actually gives rise to the physical realm and the mind. So the brain and the mind are both coming from the field. There are many names for the field that are in use now, and you can take a look at these. Some of them you'll recognize, but they're all attempts to show how there's a field of consciousness, and out of the field of consciousness comes the material realm with its matter and energy, and the mind, which interacts with the physical realm. Now, these are not tenable as well. For one thing, none of these explanations demonstrated that consciousness is in a field, or what the field is that contains consciousness. The problem remains of not being able to explain how the brain receives the information from the field or sends information into the field to function outside of the brain. The mind functions perfectly well without the brain's assistance in near-death experiences and after the transition from using the body. If the mind were in a field linking brains, the mind would need a functioning brain to have experiences and remember them, but in a near-death experience, it doesn't. So none of these explanations of the brain-mind relationship are viable. The brain does not create the mind, the brain does not receive signals like a TV, and the brain is not in a field that gives rise to both the physical realm and to the mind. So we know that the brain does not create the mind.